Hey guys, so many of you have asked me to do Saint Therese, so I'm going to do Saint Therese of Lisieux today. And if you notice, I have this Phoenix Suns shirt. They're my favorite basketball team because I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm actually going to go back to Phoenix today to see my family for Thanksgiving, and then I'll be back next week. Hopefully, you'll get to see your families over Thanksgiving too. Saint Therese of Lisieux is a saint that loved her family, and her family taught her how to love not only the family, but how to love others, including God. So that's who we're going to learn about today. She was born in 1873 and lived until 1897. Where did you first learn about God? Did you first learn about God in religion class, in Sunday school, in church on Sunday morning? If you're like most kids, the good news about God's love came to you long before you sat in a classroom or knelt in a church. Most likely, you first heard about God from your family. It was probably your mom, your dad, or one of your grandparents who taught you about God. They taught you your prayers, they read you Bible stories at bedtime, they answered all those questions you had about the crucifix on the wall, the Advent candles, the no meat on Fridays during Lent. You learned about God from your family in another way too. What's the most important thing anyone can know about God? That He loves you. Well, where's the first place that you were loved? And who were the first people who loved you? That's right. You were first loved right in your own home, by your family. So even as tiny babies lying in a crib, you were learning about God. When people cuddled you and fed you, they were teaching you what love is. As you got older and your family listened to your problems and had fun with you, they were teaching you what love is. They weren't teaching you with words, they were teaching you with their hearts and their actions. That way, when you got old enough to hear about God's love, you could recognize it. A little more than 100 years ago, a young girl lived in a very loving family. On the outside, there was nothing special about them. They weren't really wealthy, they weren't royalty, they were just a family. They were the Martins. Miss Martin had 10 children, but many of them died when they were just babies. By the time the youngest, Therese, was born, only 4 others were still alive. All of them were girls: Marie, Pauline, Celine, and Leonie. The Martins had a happy home, and when little Therese was born, she was surrounded by love. Her parents loved God very much, and they put Him at the center of their family life every hour of the day. When Therese was 4 years old, something quite sad happened. Her mother died. Little Therese was terribly upset, and she never forgot how lost and confused she felt when her mother died. But luckily for Therese, she had those 4 older sisters. All of them took care of their little sister. They did what their mother would have wanted. They taught Therese about God's love and showed her what love is. Her favorite sister was Pauline. When Therese was about 10 years old, Pauline became a nun. The convent she joined was very strict. Therese could go visit her sister, but she could only see her through a little window in a wall that was in the middle of the convent's parlor. The nuns, called the Carmelites, were so strict because they wanted to spend their time focusing only on God. But Pauline could write letters, and she did. She sent Therese a notebook that was decorated with beautifully drawn flowers. She told Therese to write in this book every day all the prayers and the good deeds she did. Pauline told Therese that every prayer and every loving act was like a little flower. If Therese watered these little flowers with even more prayers and love, they would keep growing and growing, making the world a beautiful place for everyone. The book was very special to Therese. In just a few years, her sister Marie joined the convent too. Therese was praying more and more, getting closer and closer to Jesus. When she was only 14, she decided it was time for her to follow her sisters and give her life to Jesus. It wasn't easy. Her choice made her father sad at first, but soon he agreed. Unfortunately, the bishops didn't agree, because Therese was so young. The bishop didn't want to give her permission to start such a hard life. But Therese knew what she wanted, and she knew someone who would change the bishop's mind: the Pope. Therese and her father traveled to Rome. No one knew what Therese was going to do when she entered St. Peter's Basilica with hundreds of people to see the Pope. No one knew that this young girl, so strong and so full of love for Jesus, could be so brave. Therese went right up to Pope Leo, knelt in front of him, and blurted out her story. She told him that even though she was young, she wanted to enter the convent. Would he please give her permission? He didn't exactly. He told Therese that if it's God's will, she would be able to enter. A few months later, right after Christmas, the letter came, and Bishop had given her permission to enter the convent. It was the best Christmas present Therese has ever received. For the next 10 years, Therese lived a quiet life in the convent. She prayed, worked hard with other sisters, including her real sisters, and studied God's Word. Therese had only one goal in life: to love God. She knew that God had given her the gift of life. She knew that God had saved her through Jesus' suffering and resurrection from the dead. What else was there to do but use every minute of her day to thank Him? So Therese loved God. With every sweep of the floor or stir of the kitchen pot, she loved God. With every friendly nod to even the most difficult nun in the convent, she loved God. With every step, Therese loved God. And finally, Therese loved God with pain, sickness, and suffering. She was so young when she died, only 24 years old. She had suffered terribly from tuberculosis, a disease that damages your lungs, and it makes it hard to breathe and makes you cough up blood. Even with all that pain, Therese still loved God and thanked Him for life. She planted little flowers of love and care for everyone around her. You won't believe how those flowers grew. Before she died, Therese wrote down all of her thoughts about loving God. She also wrote down stories about her life. After she died, all these things were published in a book. This is my copy. Within just a few years, millions of people had read this book. They learned more about God's love from Therese's simple words than they ever could from fat, hard-to-read religion books. Just think about it. Therese had been raised and loved by her family and had lived her whole adult life in a convent. She quietly worked, prayed, and cared for others. She knew only a few people. She spent her days in the same simple rooms, eating the same simple food, and wearing the same simple clothes. But today, millions of people know and love Therese. Her words are some of the wisest words ever written about God and His love. Therese's life was full of flowers. They were little at first, just tiny seeds planted by her parents and sisters. Therese cared for the flowers. She watered them with the love she learned from her family, added her own love, and shared the flowers with the people close to her and with the whole world. Her flowers grew into an abundant garden. What a lovely garden it is! Saint Therese learned about God's love from her family. So my question for you: what are you going to do over this Thanksgiving break that shares the love of God? Until next time, I'll talk to you guys. God bless.